The first mistake people make during collapse is assuming that closeness equals safety. It feels instinctive. When fear rises, humans cluster. We seek warmth, agreement, confirmation that we're not alone in what we're sensing. That instinct once kept us alive. But in a collapsing system, it becomes a liability. The moment danger becomes dynamic, togetherness stops protecting and starts slowing everything down. In stable societies, groups function because the environment absorbs friction. Laws exist. Supply chains buffer mistakes. Authority resolves disputes. Cooperation works because there's infrastructure to carry its weight. When that structure erodes, the same behaviors create drag. Every extra voice adds delay. Every shared decision multiplies hesitation. Coordination becomes friction. The earliest danger isn't chaos. It's delay disguised as discussion. Groups don't freeze because they're stupid. They freeze because they're trying to stay aligned. Consensus takes time. Agreement takes emotional labor. In moments that require speed, those processes become liabilities. While a group is talking, conditions are already changing. Individuals, by contrast, don't need permission to act. They respond to signals directly. They can test, retreat, adjust, and move again without consensus. Groups must synchronize before moving, and synchronization is fragile under pressure. The larger the group, the slower the response. Another hidden cost of groups is emotional gravity. Fear spreads faster in clusters. So does reassurance. Someone always tries to calm the room. Someone minimizes risk. Someone insists things will stabilize. This emotional smoothing delays action and keeps people anchored to a reality that's already dissolving. Groups also punish deviation. The first person to voice concern is often labeled dramatic. The first to prepare is accused of panic. The first to leave is judged as selfish. Social pressure enforces stillness even when movement would save lives. Conformity becomes a survival strategy until it becomes the reason people can't escape. What makes this especially dangerous is that group failure feels orderly. There's no obvious panic at first. Just meetings, discussions, waiting. The collapse doesn't look like chaos. It looks like normalcy stretched too thin. That's why it's so seductive. The irony is that groups often believe they are strong because they are many. But numbers without agility create weight, not resilience. In fast-changing environments, flexibility matters more than mass. Speed beats scale. Awareness beats agreement. This doesn't mean groups are useless. It means they're slow to adapt when conditions change quickly. They excel at maintaining systems, not escaping failing ones. Collapse doesn't reward stability. It rewards timing. The first failure of groups is not violence, panic, or betrayal. It's hesitation. And hesitation, once it sets in, is almost impossible to reverse. That's why those who survive often look like outliers. Not because they rejected others, but because they recognized when togetherness stopped being protection and started becoming an anchor. And by the time most people realize that shift has happened, the window to move has already closed. In stable times, groups feel like protection. Shared responsibility reduces fear, distributes effort, and softens uncertainty. But when conditions destabilize, the same mechanisms that once created strength begin to slow everything down. Decision-making turns heavy. Every choice must pass through layers of agreement, reassurance, and emotional calibration. What once felt collaborative now becomes friction, and friction, under pressure, burns time you no longer have. As stress rises, people don't become irrational. They become cautious in different directions. One person wants to act immediately. Another wants more information. A third wants consensus. None of them are wrong, but together they stall. The group starts orbiting the problem instead of moving through it. Action becomes a negotiation, not a response. This delay is rarely recognized as danger. It feels responsible, thoughtful, mature. Yet collapse doesn't care how considerate your process is. While the group debates, conditions shift. Access narrows, options expire. By the time agreement forms, the moment it was meant for has passed. The deeper issue is emotional regulation. In groups, people manage not just facts, but feelings. They soften language to avoid conflict. They downplay urgency to prevent panic. They adjust their words to maintain cohesion. This emotional labor drains focus and slows decisions. Stability becomes a performance rather than a reality. Accountability also dissolves inside consensus. When everyone owns a decision, no one fully does. Failure becomes collective and therefore abstract. This encourages delay because waiting rarely feels like a mistake. It feels safe. No one can be blamed for not acting when everyone agreed to pause. Leadership could solve this, but true leadership under collapse requires decisiveness that often appears rude or reckless. Most groups resist it. They prefer reassurance over direction. A leader who pushes for movement is seen as disruptive. A leader who waits feels comforting. And comfort wins until it costs too much. The paradox is that intelligence doesn't prevent this. Smart groups can fail faster than simple ones because they overanalyze. They see every angle, consider every risk, and drown in possibility. Insight becomes paralysis. Meanwhile, conditions evolve without their input. Groups also carry emotional gravity. Relationships matter. History matters. No one wants to be the person who breaks the circle. Leaving feels like betrayal, even when staying is clearly harmful. Loyalty becomes a trap, keeping people tethered to a sinking situation because detachment feels immoral. Survival doesn't require consensus. It requires timing. It demands the ability to act before certainty arrives. Groups struggle with this because certainty is their currency. When it disappears, so does their momentum. That's why collapse favors those who can move without permission. Not because they are selfish, but because they understand that agreement is a luxury. And in unstable conditions, luxuries are the first things to disappear. Once a group forms, it begins to tell itself a story. Not just about what it's doing, but about who it is. That story becomes a shared identity, a lens through which every event is interpreted. Identity brings cohesion, but it also brings fragility. The moment a group starts protecting the story more than the truth, it trades awareness for comfort. At first, this identity feels stabilizing. Shared language, shared jokes, shared explanations for what's happening outside. It creates emotional insulation. People feel safer when they believe they belong to something coherent. But coherence can quickly turn into confinement. When the story becomes more important than the facts, reality becomes negotiable. This is where danger grows quietly. New information is no longer evaluated on its accuracy, but on whether it fits the group narrative. If it supports the shared story, it's accepted. If it challenges it, it's questioned, softened, or dismissed. Facts become opinions. Warnings become negativity. And those who speak them become problems. Group identity begins to act like a filter. Only information that reinforces unity passes through cleanly. Everything else creates friction. The group doesn't need to silence dissent. Social pressure does it automatically. People learn what tone is acceptable. They learn when to stop talking. They learn which questions make others uncomfortable. Over time, this creates an illusion of consensus. It feels like agreement, but it's actually avoidance. Everyone senses the tension, but no one wants to be the one who disrupts the shared narrative. Stability becomes performative. Everyone acts as if things are under control because admitting otherwise would fracture the group. This is where collapse accelerates. The group isn't ignorant, it's restrained. Members are aware of inconsistencies, but they suppress them to preserve cohesion. The cost of speaking up feels higher than the cost of being wrong, and so the group drifts, guided more by comfort than by accuracy. Responsibility also dissolves under shared identity. When everyone belongs, no one leads. Decisions blur into collective inertia. People assume someone else will speak up, make a call, or take initiative. That assumption spreads until no one acts. In the absence of clear agency, time is wasted, and time is the one resource collapse never refunds. Meanwhile, individuals inside the group feel the tension rising. They sense something is off. They notice patterns others ignore. But speaking up feels like betrayal. So they self-censor. They tell themselves they're overthinking. They wait for confirmation that never comes. Eventually, the group doesn't fail because it lacked information. It fails because it refused to integrate it. The desire to remain unified outweighs the need to adapt. Identity hardens. Reality shifts, and the gap between them becomes fatal. Those who survive often do so by stepping outside the story before it collapses. They don't announce their departure. They don't argue. They simply stop feeding the narrative. They move quietly, not because they reject others, but because they refuse to be trapped by a shared illusion. Groups don't fail because they are weak. They fail because identity becomes heavier than truth. And when that happens, movement becomes impossible. Leadership feels like stability when everything else is uncertain. When fear rises, people instinctively look for someone who appears confident, decisive, and calm. A leader gives shape to chaos. They speak when others hesitate. They point when others freeze. In functioning systems, this role is essential. It organizes action and prevents paralysis. But collapse changes what leadership costs. In unstable conditions, leadership concentrates pressure. Every question flows upward. Every decision bottlenecks through one mind. Every emotional reaction seeks regulation from the same source. What once felt like support becomes gravity. The leader becomes the emotional and logistical center of the group, and that center begins to buckle under its own weight. The problem isn't incompetence, it's volume. Too many variables converge on one person. Too many decisions demand resolution. Too many people want reassurance, clarity, and certainty, things that no individual can provide when the environment itself is unstable. Leadership becomes less about direction and more about damage control. As pressure increases, something subtle happens. The group begins to offload responsibility onto the leader. Decisions that individuals could make themselves are deferred. Initiative disappears. People wait for instructions rather than adapting on their own. The group's survival instinct narrows to a single point, and that point becomes fragile. This creates a dangerous asymmetry. One person carries cognitive and emotional weight for many. When they hesitate, everyone stalls. When they're wrong, everyone suffers. When they burn out, the group collapses abruptly because no one else has practiced decision-making. Even worse, leadership becomes symbolic. The leader stops being a problem solver and becomes a symbol of safety. People believe that as long as the leader is present, things are under control. That belief delays action and encourages dependency. Reality becomes filtered through the leader's mood and words instead of direct observation. When pressure increases, expectations turn into resentment. If the leader can't fix things, frustration builds. Authority erodes. Loyalty fractures. The same people who once leaned on leadership begin to question it. Trust decays faster than it formed. This is where collapse accelerates. Not because of external threats, but because internal structure fails. The leader, once a stabilizing force, becomes a focal point for blame. The group fractures around that failure. Chaos follows. Survivors understand this pattern early. They avoid becoming central figures. They resist being elevated. They redirect responsibility instead of absorbing it. They encourage autonomy rather than obedience. They know that being the one everyone depends on is not power, it's exposure. In unstable environments, resilience comes from decentralization. Each person must retain the ability to act independently. Coordination matters, but command does not. Information flows sideways, not upward. Decisions are local, not centralized. Strong groups aren't led, they're aligned. They share awareness without surrendering autonomy. They communicate without consolidating control. They move fluidly, not hierarchically. The moment leadership becomes symbolic rather than functional, the system is already failing. And the longer someone tries to hold it together alone, the harder the collapse will hit when it finally breaks. That's why the most adaptive move is often to step back before being elevated. Not out of fear, but out of understanding. Because once people start looking to you for certainty, you're already standing on ground that can no longer hold you. Groups don't collapse because they fight. They collapse because they eat themselves slowly. Consumption outpaces awareness. Every additional person adds weight. Not just physical, but cognitive and emotional. More needs, more expectations, more friction. At first, it feels manageable. Shared meals, shared tasks, shared optimism. But beneath that surface, demand is quietly accelerating. In the early phase, abundance masks inefficiency. Resources still flow, energy feels renewable. People believe cooperation multiplies output. But what actually multiplies faster is overhead. Coordination takes time. Fairness takes explanation. Emotional reassurance takes energy. None of these produce resources, they only spend them. An individual can adjust instantly. Skip a meal, change pace. Change direction. A group cannot. Every adjustment requires agreement. Every change must be justified. Even small decisions consume attention and calories. Over time, the group begins spending more energy managing itself than surviving its environment. This is where the illusion of strength begins to crack. A group looks powerful because it's loud and visible. But visibility requires maintenance. Reassurance must be given. Conflicts must be smoothed. Expectations must be managed. What looks like unity is often just constant negotiation under stress. Scarcity exposes this quickly. When resources tighten, differences surface. Some want to conserve. Others want to consume while they can. Some think long-term. Others panic. Each position feels reasonable in isolation. Together, they paralyze action. The group spends more time debating priorities than addressing them. Moral pressure then replaces logic. No one wants to be the one who says no. No one wants to draw the line. Compassion becomes a weapon against decision-making. We can't leave them. We can't cut back now. We'll figure it out. These phrases feel humane, but they ignore arithmetic. Compassion without limits drains everyone. Groups also struggle with subtraction. Removing a member feels like betrayal, even when necessary, so weight accumulates. Resources thin. The group adapts by lowering standards rather than reducing load. Efficiency drops. Fatigue rises. The system weakens quietly until it fails suddenly. Individuals, by contrast, can recalibrate instantly. They can reduce intake, change strategy, move differently tomorrow than they did today. They don't need consensus to act. That flexibility is not selfishness, it's responsiveness. In unstable conditions, responsiveness is survival. Collapse doesn't punish care. It punishes unbounded care. When concern expands faster than capacity, collapse is guaranteed. Groups don't fail because they care too much. They fail because care without limits becomes consumption. The moment a group consumes more than it can regenerate, it's living on borrowed time. That debt compounds quietly, invisibly, until there's nothing left to borrow. And when the balance hits zero, collapse doesn't negotiate. It simply arrives. The lone survivor is rarely what people imagine. They aren't antisocial, ruthless, or emotionally detached. More often, they are simply attentive. They notice limits early, their own and everyone else's. They understand that survival isn't about strength or dominance, but about managing exposure. Where others accumulate obligations, they subtract them. What separates them is not isolation, but autonomy. They don't reject connection, they reject dependency. They understand that connection under pressure becomes leverage, and leverage becomes liability. When resources thin and choices narrow, the ability to act without negotiation becomes the most valuable asset a person can have. Being alone reduces noise. Without constant input, the mind regains clarity. Decisions sharpen. Patterns become visible. Every additional voice adds friction, not insight. The lone survivor isn't antisocial. They're signal-focused. They remove interference so they can read the environment accurately instead of reacting to social currents. This doesn't mean they live in isolation forever. It means they choose timing carefully. Connection becomes intentional instead of habitual. They engage when the cost is low and disengage when the cost rises. That selectivity is often misread as coldness, but it's actually precision. Many mistake independence for arrogance. In reality, it's a form of restraint. The lone survivor resists the urge to be needed. They don't measure their worth by how many people rely on them. They understand that being indispensable often means being trapped. Dependency creates gravity, and gravity pulls everything toward collapse. There's an uncomfortable truth beneath this. Most people don't fail because they lack ability. They fail because they cling to loyalty long after it stops being mutual. Loyalty to routines. Loyalty to groups. Loyalty to identities built for a world that no longer exists. That loyalty delays adaptation until adaptation becomes impossible. The lone survivor breaks that bond early, not out of cruelty, but out of clarity. They recognize when allegiance becomes inertia. They step away before expectations solidify. They allow others to choose their own paths, even when those paths lead somewhere darker. This detachment isn't emotional numbness. It's emotional discipline. The ability to feel without being ruled by feeling. To care without being consumed. To observe suffering without sacrificing the capacity to act later. It's a form of patience that looks like distance from the outside. When stability eventually returns, these individuals often reemerge quietly. Not as heroes, not as leaders, but as witnesses. They understand what happened because they saw it, without the fog of belonging. They carry lessons instead of scars, perspective instead of resentment. The irony is that the people best positioned to help later are often the ones who step back first. Survival gave them time, clarity, and choice. They didn't win by being stronger or smarter. They won by moving when movement still mattered. In collapse, survival isn't about morality or courage. It's about timing. And the loneliest choice, stepping away early, is often the one that keeps you alive long enough to matter again.